The summer of 1964 was not hot. It was boiling. The heat didn't just sit on the city, it pressed down like a physical weight, crushing the breath out of the avenues. The asphalt was soft enough to leave footprints in. But the heat wasn't the problem. The problem was the sound. If you stood on the corner of 123rd Street and 7th Avenue on that Sunday night in July, you heard the sound of a society tearing itself apart. It started as a low rumble, the sound of 1,000 feet moving on pavement, then the crash of glass, sharp, violent, final. A bottle smashing against a police cruiser, a window of a department store giving way. Then the sirens, not one or two, but a symphony of wails that drowned out the jazz from the clubs. The police were losing. The tactical patrol force, men with helmets and batons, were forming lines, sweat stinging their eyes, fear tightening their grips. They were pushing against a tide of anger that had been rising for decades. The radio chatter was frantic. Officer down, looting on Lenox, fire on 125th. The city of New York, the greatest metropolis on earth, had lost control of its own heart. But 3 blocks away, in the middle of this inferno, there was a vacuum, an impossible silence. On a residential street just east of the chaos, a single folding chair sat on the sidewalk. It wasn't behind a barricade, it wasn't behind a wall of security guards. It was out in the open, exposed to the smoke drifting from the burning trash cans. Sitting in the chair was a man reading a newspaper. He turned the page slowly. The rustle of the paper was audible because on this block no one was shouting, no one was running, no windows were breaking. A group of teenagers, eyes wild with the adrenaline of the riot, sprinted around the corner, bricks in their hands, looking for the next target. They saw the man in the chair. They skidded to a halt. The lead boy, his face covered in soot, lowered his brick. He didn't speak, he just signaled the others. They turned around and ran back toward the fire. They would rather face the riot police than cross the invisible line drawn by the man reading the paper. If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Civilizations do not die from murder. They die from suicide. They collapse from within. History is a graveyard of empires that grew too big, too greedy, or too violent to sustain themselves. Look at the Roman Empire. Look at the Dutch Schultz gang. Look at the fracturing of the 5 families during the Appalachian disaster. When the pressure mounts, structures crack. Chaos is the natural state of the criminal underworld. But the files, the deep intelligence reports that the FBI filed away under sociological phenomena, tell a story that defies the laws of entropy. While the Italian Mafia was eating itself alive with internal purges in the 1960s, and while unorganized street gangs were burning down their own neighborhoods, Bumpy Johnson's Harlem remained a fortress of stability. Most criminologists will tell you this was because of fear. They are wrong. Fear is a temporary adhesive. It dries out and cracks under heat. What Bumpy Johnson built wasn't a dictatorship based on terror. It was a masterpiece of structural engineering. He understood a hidden truth that no other crime lord of his era grasped. Stability is a product, and if you are the only one selling it, you own the market. This story changes how we understand the concept of the criminal. It suggests that in a neglected ecosystem, the crime lord becomes the governor. To understand how the walls stayed up while the roof was caving in, you have to look at the foundation. You have to strip away the legend of the gangster and look at the man who sat alone in the dark, doing the math. Bumpy wasn't born a king. He was born into a world where power was transient. He watched men rise like meteors, flashing, violent, loud, and burn out just as fast. He saw the mad dogs of the Prohibition era. They ruled by the gun, and they died by the gun, usually leaving behind nothing but a chalk outline and a power vacuum that led to more war. Bumpy was different. He was terrified of chaos. This is the part the movies leave out. They show the swagger. They don't show the insomnia. Bumpy Johnson lived with a chronic, gnawing anxiety about disorder. He viewed an uncontrolled street not as an opportunity, but as a failure of management. When a fight broke out in a bar under his protection, he didn't ask who won. He asked why the bouncer hadn't de-escalated it. When a shipment was hijacked, he didn't just want revenge. He wanted to know where the information leak was in the logistics chain. He treated crime like a utility company. When you flip the switch, the light goes on. You don't know how the electricity is generated. You don't know the name of the engineer, but you pay the bill because the service is reliable. Bumpy wanted Vice to be as reliable as the electric company. By the early 1960s, the landscape was shifting. The old codes were dying. The Italian families were under siege. Robert F. Kennedy was Attorney General, and he was tearing the mob apart with subpoenas and wiretaps. The code of Omerta was breaking down. Valachi was singing to the Senate. The gentleman's agreement between the races was fraying. In Brooklyn, the profound instability led to bodies in car trunks. Captains were killing their own soldiers just to tie up loose ends. Paranoia was the currency of the day. But in Harlem, the machine kept humming. Why? Because Bumpy Johnson had integrated his operation into the very nervous system of the community. He didn't hide in a fortress, he sat in the diner. He walked the street. He made himself the visible anchor. In a time when the government had largely abandoned Harlem, when garbage wasn't picked up, when schools were underfunded, when the police were viewed as invaders, Bumpy filled the void. Bumpy was different. He was terrified of chaos. This is the part the movies leave out. They show the swagger. They don't show the insomnia. Bumpy Johnson lived with a chronic, gnawing anxiety about disorder. He viewed an uncontrolled street not as an opportunity, but as a failure of management. When a fight broke out in a bar under his protection, he didn't ask who won. He asked why the bouncer hadn't de-escalated it. When a shipment was hijacked, he didn't just want revenge. He wanted to know where the information leak was in the logistics chain. He treated crime like a utility company. When you flip the switch, the light goes on. You don't know how the electricity is generated. You don't know the name of the engineer, but you pay the bill because the service is reliable. Bumpy wanted Vice to be as reliable as the electric company. By the early 1960s, the landscape was shifting. The old codes were dying. The Italian families were under siege. Robert F. Kennedy was Attorney General, and he was tearing the mob apart with subpoenas and wiretaps. The code of Omerta was breaking down. Valachi was singing to the Senate. The gentleman's agreement between the races was fraying. In Brooklyn, the profound instability led to bodies in car trunks. Captains were killing their own soldiers just to tie up loose ends. Paranoia was the currency of the day. But in Harlem, the machine kept humming. Why? Because Bumpy Johnson had integrated his operation into the very nervous system of the community. He didn't hide in a fortress, he sat in the diner. He walked the street. He made himself the visible anchor. In a time when the government had largely abandoned Harlem, when garbage wasn't picked up, when schools were underfunded, when the police were viewed as invaders, Bumpy filled the void. He created a welfare state funded by the numbers racket. If a landlord was evicting a family illegally, Bumpy's lawyer, a sharp man in a shark-skin suit, would show up at housing court. If that didn't work, Bumpy's enforcers would pay the landlord a visit, not to break his legs, but to explain the economics of a vacant building versus a building with a paying tenant. He stabilized the economy of the street. He set price controls on the numbers game so that a hit paid out consistently. He mediated disputes between rival crews before they turned into shooting wars. He was the Supreme Court of the underground. But the tension was rising. It was 1963, then 1964. The civil rights movement was exploding. Malcolm X was preaching on the corners. The anger in the streets was becoming political, righteous, and dangerous. The young men weren't looking to be gangsters anymore. They were looking to be revolutionaries. The Italian bosses came to Bumpy. They were nervous. They saw the marches, the protests, the anger. They told him, "Clamp it down, keep them quiet, we can't have heat." Bumpy looked at them across the table at the crisp, white linen restaurant downtown. He saw their fear. They thought they could control the tide with a dam. Bumpy knew you had to build a canal. You can't stop the water, he told them. You have to direct it. He began to quietly pivot. He didn't fight the revolutionaries. He offered them protection. When Malcolm X needed security that the police wouldn't provide, Bumpy's men were there, standing in the shadows, silent sentinels. He aligned himself with the spirit of the rebellion without becoming a politician. He made sure the anger was directed outward, at the system, not inward, at the community. This was a dangerous game. The FBI was watching. They saw a black crime lord coordinating with black radicals. To J. Edgar Hoover, this was the ultimate nightmare. They stepped up the surveillance. They raided his associates. They tried to bleed him dry. Every day was a walk on a tightrope. One slip, one uncontrolled shooting, one riot that burned down the wrong business, and the National Guard would roll in, and the empire would be crushed. And then came the test, the summer of '64. The riot didn't start because of Bumpy. It started because of a police shooting, a 15-year-old boy. The spark hit the gasoline. As the fires raged on that Sunday night, the calls started coming into the station house. The 28th precinct was under siege. The captain, a man who had spent 20 years chasing Bumpy, watched his command board light up with red. He had no cars left. He had no men left. The looters were moving toward the commercial district, toward the banks, toward the infrastructure that kept the neighborhood alive. The captain looked at the phone. He knew there was only one man who had the reserves, the manpower, and the authority to stop the bleeding. He picked up the receiver. The line rang in an apartment on 121st Street. Bumpy picked it up on the second ring. "Johnson," he said. "It's burning, Bumpy," the voice on the other end said. "No names, no titles, just the raw reality. They're moving on 125th. If they burn the supermarkets, there's no food tomorrow. If they burn the banks, there's no cash. The neighborhood dies." "I know," said Bumpy. Can you talk to them?" The silence on the line was heavy. It was the sound of the state admitting it had failed. It was the sound of the law asking the outlaw for permission to restore order. "I don't talk to mobs," Bumpy said slowly. "I talk to men." "Just do what you do," the captain said, and hung up. Bumpy stood up. He adjusted his tie. He put on his jacket. He didn't call for an army. He called for 4 men, his lieutenants. They drove to 125th Street in a single car. The street was a war zone. Glass covered the pavement like snow. Smoke billowed from a clothing store. A crowd of 300 angry, shouting men and women were surging toward a large appliance store, ready to tear the gates down. The car stopped. Bumpy got out. He didn't have a megaphone. He didn't have a weapon drawn. He simply walked into the middle of the street, between the mob and the store. He stood there, hands clasped in front of him. The front line of the mob saw him. The recognition rippled back like a wave. It's Bumpy. That's the old man. The shouting didn't stop, but the movement did. The momentum broke. Bumpy raised a hand, not a fist, an open palm. "This is our house," his voice boomed. It wasn't a shout, it was a projection, deep and resonant. "You burn this down, you burn your own bed. You break this glass, you cut your own feet." A young man with a bottle in his hand stepped forward. "They killed a kid, Bumpy. We gotta hurt 'em." Bumpy looked the young man in the eye. "Then hurt them," he said, pointing toward the emptiness where the police used to be. "Don't hurt us. This store pays rent to Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable lives in your building. You burn this, you burn her." He walked forward, stepping on the glass, closing the distance to the young man. "Go home, cool off. We fight tomorrow, but we fight smart." The young man lowered the bottle. He looked at Bumpy, then looked at the crowd. The anger was still there, but the direction had changed. The chaotic, mindless destruction had been checked by a higher authority. Slowly, agonizingly, the crowd began to disperse. They drifted away into the side streets. The appliance store stood. The supermarket stood. The next morning, the newspapers talked about the police regaining control. They talked about the tactical squads. They didn't mention the man in the suit standing in the glass. But the neighborhood knew. That was the secret of the stability. Other empires collapsed because they were rigid. They were brittle. When the wind blew, they broke. Bumpy's empire was flexible. It absorbed the shock. He absorbed the anger of the street and grounded it before it could destroy the foundation. He wasn't just a crime lord, he was the shock absorber for 1 million people. Years later, when the heroin epidemic finally did what the police never could, rotting the city from the inside out, people would look back on the Bumpy Johnson era with a strange nostalgia. They wouldn't remember the extortions or the threats. They would remember that the streets were safe to walk on. They would remember that there was a hierarchy. The stability of Harlem wasn't an accident. It was a manufactured product, built by a man who knew that in the absence of justice, order is the next best thing, and order has a price. Bumpy Johnson paid that price every day, in every sleepless night, in every cold calculation. He showed that power isn't about being the strongest man in the room. It's about being the one man who, when the world is on fire, has the discipline to sit in a folding chair and read the paper. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.